Good morning, everyone. This is quite a weird situation for me, talking to a screen, but I will just go ahead. I'm going to switch to the slides shortly. I'm in a pretty dark room, so I think it will be nicer to see more of what I'm presenting on. Can everyone hear me all right? Can people just maybe put a quick comment in saying that they can hear me? Thanks, Ray. Thanks, Vivian. All right, I am going to switch now to the slides. Great. So thanks everyone for coming today. And if you haven't already, it would be great if you could participate in the poll that I set up, just so I can get a clearer idea of the kind of people I'm talking to. It's really just trying to gauge what kind of social enterprise activity you're involved in at the moment, whether you're part of a startup or not-for-profit, maybe even an established social enterprise. And yes, the slides will be available at the end of the session. I'll email them out to everyone along with a feedback form, which would be really great if you guys could fill that out for us, just so we can keep improving on our workshops. With the slides, I'll send out the speaker notes as well, so you can feel free just to listen in today. You don't have to take too many notes, but there's not much to look at either, so that's fine. And as we go through, do feel free to just pop some questions in the chat box. I'll be keeping an eye on it. There's also a Q&A, but people seem to be using the chat already, so let's just stick with that. Okay, so for those of you who haven't heard of Ākina before, well, you obviously have heard of us because you've signed up for this webinar, but we are a charity who our purpose is to support social enterprise. So what we're really trying to do is build an enabling environment for social enterprise. Our overall aim is to create a sustainable, prosperous and inclusive New Zealand, and we want to do that through the vehicle of social enterprise. And so our specific role is providing all kinds of support, right from these workshops, which are at the early stages, right through to trying to raise investment when you're trying to scale your enterprise. So what is social enterprise? This is a topic of great debate worldwide. But for the purposes of today and for Ākina's purposes, we like to say that it's an organisation that is driven by a social or environmental purpose. That's its reason for existence. But it does that by creating a trading enterprise with the hope that eventually it completely sustains itself, so that it's not reliant on grant funding or any external funding. It may also be that you're engaged in social enterprise activity if you're a not-for-profit who does take on grants, but this is an alternative income stream. So it's really supporting your social purpose by trading in order to create revenue. So the topic of today is legal structures, but I want to just set the scene a bit first, thinking about governance as a whole. So the law, legal structures are part of the overall legal framework in New Zealand or in the world. And the purpose of the law is really to create some rules. It's about controlling activities. It's about creating accountability and efficiency. Oh, there's feedback. Okay, you're creating efficiency and trying to work as well as possible with each other. And we know that if we have no rules, then things will just be chaotic. So we really try to create rules that facilitate our activities without creating too many rules that create that create unnecessary restrictions on us. So with social enterprise, we're doing two things. On the one hand, we have a business model, and on the other hand, we have an impact model. And in reality, these are all connected. and you don't really separate out these two activities. But when we're thinking about legal structures and governance, we want to think, how are we trying to change the world, and how can we use rules and governance to protect that mission and make sure that we're staying on track? And in terms of the business model, how can we use rules and accountability to make sure that we're thriving as a business and we're getting the resources we need to grow to the scale we need to? So what we'll look at today is to start off with a little bit on governance. What does governance mean? What are the different elements of governance? Because legal structures are one element of that. We'll look at what it means to incorporate. So choosing a legal form, what does that actually mean and when is it useful? I'll go over a couple of the most common legal forms and their characteristics, and then we'll talk about charitable status. And finally, we'll look at, if we don't have charitable status, what are other ways that we can use to protect mission? So governance, I've put down a short definition here. All of the processes of exerting influence over or holding in check, whether through laws, norms, power, or language. So you've probably heard the term governance used a lot in terms of corporate governance, and that's usually referring to people that sit on the board of trustees or the board of directors. That's another way in which governance is used, but for these purposes, we're thinking about how do you govern an organization? So there are laws, there are the broad range of laws that say what people generally can and can't do and what businesses can and can't do. And of course, there are the legal structures, which are set up by legislation, which are essentially just a bunch of rules. There are norms, so the way that people tend to act in an organization, the normal ways of doing things, the culture, this can become part of the governance of an organization. Power relationships, and so this might mean the relationship between a boss and someone else, or just someone that is very successful in gaining influence in an organization. And finally, language. You can just have conversation with people, discuss things, and that can be part of how you govern an organization. So first we're going to look at some of the people factors, because this really feeds into how you select your legal structure. So the first level of people within governance is the shareholders, members, or settlers. So those are different terms that we'll look at shortly in relation to different organizations, organizational structures, but we'll just for now focus on these people as the owners of the organization. So they have the overall power. They've usually set up the organization, and their role is to look at what's the purpose of the organization, what is it for? They'll look at the board, so who are they going to appoint to run the organization? People at this level generally don't take a role in managing the organization. And then they'll set up some rules which determine for the board how they are accountable to the shareholders. Because if you're an owner of an organization and someone else is managing it, I don't really know what to do about the echo. I might try putting some headphones in quickly. Is that any better? No. Okay. Just 1 second. Okay, thanks, Jason. Thanks, everyone. Okay, I'll try closing down all other tabs, but otherwise I'm just going to have to continue, I think. Sorry. It's fine now? Okay, thanks, guys. Great. So it's really about setting up why the organisation exists, who's going to manage its activities, and the strategic direction, and then the rules are how the people that run it are accountable to those shareholders, but also how the shareholders interact with each other. The next level below that is the board. So the board can be either, like I said, a board of trustees, a board of directors. Yes, Tim, the recording will be available. I will send that through with the slides. The board are more involved than the top level. As a board, we have strategic direction over how we're going to execute on the organisation's overall mission. There's also compliance issues. They're responsible for the operations of the business and complying with all types of regulation and internal policies. And they're also responsible for resource. So this means, how many people do we have to employ? What kind of operational things do we need in terms of a building or other resources? And also, how do we ensure that we have the capital, the money that we need to keep the business running? And finally, there's the management level, and they are responsible. So this is your CEO and all management underneath. They're responsible for operational matters and the execution of strategy. So for the purpose of legal structures, we're really looking at the first two. If we go back, it's the shareholders and the board. It's very high level legal structures. So what you won't get out of today is, how do I run my business? How do I make sure that I'm able to sell things to customers? What are my channels? That's all stuff that you need to do in a business model workshop. So what we're hoping to do when we're looking at a legal structure is have most of our operations and our strategy in place. And so that puts us in the best position to then wrap around a legal structure that facilitates our activities. So that leads us on to incorporation. What does that mean and when is it a good idea? So the first element of incorporation is that it creates a new legal person. So in the eyes of the law, if you're contracting or if you're held liable for something, it's a completely separate person. So this means that we get limited liability. So the company is liable rather than the individuals who are running the company, except in specific situations. And it also means that people can contract with the company rather than the 5,000 people that are part of the organization. So it makes it a lot easier and more efficient for the people that are dealing with the company. And that means that usually you only really need to incorporate when you start dealing with outside parties. So that could be, for example, when you're taking on investment. People don't really want to give you investment unless you've got a vehicle to put the money in, and the legal person that is responsible for delivering on what they promise. It might also be because you're entering into a big contract with a third party, and again, they want to contract with one person, not many, and they want to be able to hold one person to account. Those are the kind of reasons usually that people need to start looking at incorporation. The other side of things is once an organization starts to grow, you really want rules and accountability within the people in the organization. And so that doesn't necessarily have to be done through a legal structure, but it can be, because we'll look at this shortly, and that's really how you start looking at what legal structure will fit your personal situation. But it's really about how the owners of the company and the managers of the company interact, and also how they interact with their beneficiaries or their customers. So it is really high level. It's not about how the business runs or the operations of it. It's about rules and accountability. So when we think about how we want the different players that are involved in an organization to work together, I like to separate it into these 4 categories. So the top 2 represent ownership. So that's what I was saying before. That is the shareholders of a company, the officers of it's the members of an incorporated society, or the settlor of a trust, the person that creates the trust. And ownership usually means that you have the power to say what the organization is for and who will run it. But it can also mean that you gain the financial benefit if the organization does well. And that's not always the case, because with non-profit organizations, sometimes that part of ownership is limited. But in terms of ownership in an organization, we split it into those 2 parts: power and financial benefit. And then down in the bottom left-hand corner, we've got management, the everyday running of the company. And this is done by the board. So when I say this is done by the board, I mean the board have responsibility for it. They're not actually the ones in the company that are executing on it, but they need to sign off on everything. So again, it's that high level responsibilities and accountability. And then finally there on the bottom right-hand corner is the customer or the beneficiary. So this isn't always a big consideration, but I think especially with social enterprise, you want to start thinking about, how do I interact with my customer or beneficiary? Are they the kind of people that should be actually gaining the financial benefit, or are they the kind of people that should have some power and influence over how the organization is run? And that's not always the case, but for some types of social enterprises, that's what you want. So we'll go through a couple of the different legal structures now, and have a look at how these different elements interact with each other. Obviously, I won't stop and get you to do this now, but when I send out the slides, it would be really useful for you guys to think about your individual situations, have a think about who has the power, who's going to benefit financially if the organization is successful, who's going to be responsible for the running of the company and its strategic direction, who's going to buy your product or service, and then also who's going to receive the social benefit. So those last 2 are the customer or the beneficiary, and sometimes in social enterprise they're the same person, and sometimes they're separated out and they're different segments. So that's something else to think about. In terms of power and management, that's often the same person to start with. So really it doesn't necessarily have to be different people, but it's important that you can distinguish between the different roles that you're playing within the organization, because they often come with different responsibilities. So the first is the company. I'm just going to make this slightly bigger. Cool. So in a company, the different players that matter when it comes to legal structure are the shareholders, the directors, and the customers. I've put there directors and officers because, especially when a company gets really large, there tends to be almost a sort of overlap or merging of roles in terms of the directors and the really high level of management, like the CEO, for example. They start to take more of an oversight role, but for the purposes of the legal structure, it's really the directors that we usually talk about. So shareholders are the ones who have the power. They usually will set up the organization, and they will also benefit financially. So you will also think about shareholders in terms of people that invest in a company. When they're investing, they're actually buying into the company, and so they become a part owner. So that's where their power comes from if they weren't the ones that set up the company originally. And when I say power, it can be quite hard to distinguish sometimes. They have the power to change the direction of the company and vote on who runs it, but they don't actually have the power over the day-to-day operations of the business. So it's very high level. When we look at the directors, they're the ones that manage the day-to-day operations, and then the customers, they're the ones that benefit from the goods or services. So most of you might be familiar with the company structure, and it is the most simple. I think the important thing to see here is that it's the people that own the company and not the ones that are benefiting from the goods or services that have the power and that reap the financial benefit. And this is, I think, where sometimes companies can get a bad rap, because they may not be too fussed about their customers, because it's not the customers that get the say. There are all types of governance things that can stop this complete fixation on maximizing profits, but that's something to consider. A company is a really good structure if you want to scale. So a few of the other organizations we'll look at are, they're more about how do we interact with each other, how do we have democratic ownership, and how do the different people within the organization interact with each other. But the other consideration you need to have, either as a social enterprise or just any organization, is, do you need to grow? And if so, are you going to need growth capital? Because usually, if you need money to grow, that will come in the form of shares. It doesn't necessarily have to, but usually that's the case. So the things you need to think about, as well as how the people interact, are how do you intend to resource your company financially, and who will have the overall control. So in this case, it gives you the opportunity to inject capital through investors, which means you can scale. And not all social enterprises need to scale, but sometimes you want them to scale because you want them to be as large as the problem they're trying to solve. So an example of a company would be Conscious Consumers. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with them, but that's an organization we've worked with. And they are an app which has an accreditation service for businesses, so that the consumers can see what kind of what kind of business they are in terms of their sustainability or how they treat their workers. And in their case, they started off as an incorporated society, but found that they got to a stage where they wanted to grow, and they couldn't do that in their current structure because they didn't have the capital that they needed. So that's an example of why you might want to be a company. The next is a charitable trust, and this is a very popular structure for social organizations because it really strictly locks in your mission. So let's have a look at the players. First, there's the settler. And a settler in a trust is the person usually that injects a whole bunch of money at the outset, and also creates a trust deed, which creates a whole bunch of laws and rules that govern the trustee and the trustees forevermore, who continue to deal with the assets. And then the beneficiary get the benefit of the goods or services, but also the financial benefit. So you can see the dollar sign as compared to the company has switched from the owner to the beneficiary. So in terms of why you would want a charitable trust, actually the most common and the best example of why a charitable trust is a good idea is when you have a whole bunch of assets and you want to be able to control those assets for the benefit of someone else in the long term. So the reason the reason a trust was invented was because women couldn't own their own property. And when they married, essentially all of their property became their husband's. So people in wealthy families created this tool, the trust, so that someone else, either the husband or someone else, could hold the assets but could only use them for the benefit of the woman in the family. So it's very passive. It's about having assets but only being able to use them for the benefit of certain people. So from a social perspective, you can see why that might be appealing. But the other consideration is that the beneficiaries, they don't necessarily have a say over what is in their best interests. It's set out by the settler at the outset a lot of the time. And it's quite a fixed model. It's not very flexible, and it can be very hard to bring new capital in. So it's very strong on mission protection. It's not that strong in terms of involving the beneficiary in the operations of the organisation. And it is very strict in terms of being able to change the way things are run going forward. So if you're quite a typical startup with a social purpose, this is probably not the model for you, because you need to be agile and change the way things are going depending on what you're learning along the way. Yeah, so this tends to be more of a structure for philanthropic trusts, for example, philanthropists. But you can still trade under these because, as I said, it's very high level, these relationships. It's not about how they actually execute on their mission. But yeah, it can be hard to get capital to grow and to change the way you do things if you need to. Incorporated society is another popular one, and what you'll see here is this is the first of the organisations that we'll look at where the people who have the power are the ones who are benefiting from the good or service. So this is a classic model of a democratically run organisation. So in this case, we have the members of the organisation who the organisation exists to benefit them, and they get to vote into power the people, the officers who manage the organisation. In terms of running this as a social enterprise, the difficulty again can be capital. So any assets that go in have to stay in the organisation to be used for goods or services for the members or for society as a whole. But the capital can't be distributed, which obviously means certain types of investment are difficult. So it can lead to, again, reliance on grants, which often we're trying to move away from. But remembering that at the heart of social enterprise is trading activity and revenue from trading activity. So you can still do this in an incorporated society. And the last and most complicated one is the cooperative company. And this basically is the merging of a company and incorporated societies. So you have transacting shareholders are the main players here, and they are people that either purchase or sell to the company. So we're thinking like Fonterra, for example, here. In Fonterra, you have a whole bunch of dairy farmers that sell to the company, and then probably a whole bunch of people that package stuff, that buy the milk from the company. And it's about creating a really efficient marketplace for people with common interests. It can also be used in terms of employees, for example, giving all the employees power over the organisation. It's creating, again, more democracy within the decision-making and the power of the organisation. But then you can also have normal shareholders who can inject capital into the organisation, and you can still have customers. So with Fonterra, all of us probably still buy milk from them. You can have other customers who buy the goods or services as well. So in this case, it's like a normal company, but then there's a special type of shareholder who tends to be someone that is transacting in some way with the company, and it gives them extra power over the overall direction of the company and who gets to manage it. So are there any questions about the legal structures? It's probably quite difficult to put those into a short chat. But I guess in conclusion, I'll conclude while I wait to see if any questions arrive. In conclusion, it's about control, who runs the company, and who gets to decide who runs the company. So in that case, it's kind of like elections. We as the people vote, and then the Prime Minister and the government will then actually do the running of the country. And then how does capital or money within the company work? How can we inject it into the company? And for certain types of capital, when you're injecting it into the company, you need to be able to send it out again. So, sorry, I've just got a question. Is a charitable trust only from where donors can get special tax benefits? So with a charitable trust, and we'll have a look at charities next. Actually, I might just move on to charities for that question. So we've had a look at the different types of legal structures. So that's one level. The first thing you do is decide whether you need to incorporate or not. And then if you do need to incorporate, you'll start to look at these different structures, which are all about who has control and what's done with the profits or the assets of the organisation. And then the next thing you can look at if you're a social enterprise is charitable status. So there are some notes in the speaker notes here. But the important thing to know with charities is that they're not a separate legal entity. You have to be one of the legal entities that we've discussed, or even one of the more obscure ones, which is very uncommon. But then you apply for status, for charitable status. So it's just like someone stamps your organisation and says you've met all the requirements to be a charity, and therefore you get the benefits of being a charity. So the requirements are twofold, really. The first one is purpose. You have to have a charitable purpose. And that is actually slightly more narrow than you think. It's not anything that benefits society. It has to fall within a very specific definition of charitable purpose. So if you're thinking about being a charity, you should first think about what your activities are and then how that fits within the definition of charitable purpose, just to make sure that becoming a charity doesn't limit any of your activities. And then the second element is asset lock. So an asset lock basically means that once assets go in, they can't escape except for the charitable purpose. And that means that you have to put a bar on all distributions. So for example, if you're a company and then you got charitable status, yes, you could be a limited liability company and have charitable status. And if that were the case, you would have the same kind of structure. You'd have directors, shareholders, and beneficiaries or customers. But you would have to put a bar on any distribution. So that means the shareholders, their role would be to vote on the directors of the company, but you wouldn't be able to make any distributions to them. So if you're looking at those two elements of ownership, there's the control and there's the financial benefit. Once you incorporate or once you get charitable status, you're forfeiting that financial benefit. So 1, limits distributions. 2, on wind up, once you've wound up the company, you have to make sure that any assets that are left over continue to go towards a charitable purpose. And this also flows into your activities. So if you are providing goods or services and you provide them to someone who doesn't fall within your beneficiary group for your charitable purpose, you have to make sure that you're doing that at fair value or at market value. So if you're an organisation, okay, the limitations rewind up. Once you've wound up your organisation, so if you go into liquidation or you just decide that you don't want to do it anymore, you have to, any assets that are within your business, you have to either in your governing documents say, I will donate all of my assets to a specific charity, or just say that they'll stay in line with charitable purposes, which means that you'll have to give your assets to some charity out there. So it means that once it goes in for a charitable purpose, it can't then ever be used for a non-charitable purpose. Does that make sense? Cool. Yeah, so if you have a social enterprise, so you absolutely can be a social enterprise and be a charity, and this means that you can get benefits such as lots of places that provide grants will only give them to charities. You can have trading activities under your charity, but if you are providing those activities at a discount, it has to be for a charitable purpose. So it might be that you are providing exercise services to an underserved community, that's fine. But then if someone comes along who's actually not from that underserved community and is accessing your goods or services, you need to do that at a market rate. Otherwise, you're breaching your charitable status. So there are quite a lot of restrictions that come with being a charity. And we recommend that you don't become a charity unless one of the benefits of being a charity is integral to your business model. So the benefits include income tax exemptions. So that means that if you do make a profit, you're not taxed on that profit because it continues to be reinvested into charitable purposes. Yeah, this can be quite enticing, but again, you need to think long term whether that is going to be more useful than being able to access investment. The next benefit is donee status, which means if you have donee status, anybody that gives you money, either a grant funding organisation or if you do project crowdfunding and people gift you money, they get a benefit for their income tax. So that's an incentive for people to give you money. And then the last benefit, which is probably actually the biggest one and isn't necessarily legal, is the social status that comes with being a charity. So on the one hand, there are legal issues which mean that many grant funding organisations will only give to you if you have charitable status. So if you're hanging around for the Finding Funding workshop afterwards, we talk a little bit more about that. But it might also be important for the people that you're interacting with. So if you are trying to make revenue by being, if you're trying to trade to create revenue that then helps fund a certain activity, people might be more willing to contract with you or buy from you if you are a charity. So it's important to think, is being a charity going to help my brand for my social enterprise? Are there people that will either contract with me or that will give me certain benefits that are really important to my business model only if I'm a charity? Then that's another really good reason to become a charity. Just got a question here. Can you have an incorporated society with charitable status that set up a cooperative business model within the incorporated society? I'm not sure I completely understand that, but you can get a lot of really complicated legal structures. So something that people will often do is have a company structure, which does all of the trading activity and that can take on investment, but the majority of that company, the shares in that company, is owned by a charity, and so a charitable trust, for example. And what we've already seen is that share ownership means that you have overall control over the direction of the company, what its purpose is, and who's running the company. And so if a controlling interest is held by a charity, that means that you can ensure that the charitable purpose of the majority shareholder will always flow through to the company. In terms of an incorporated society with charitable status, yes, that's absolutely possible. Any legal structure can get charitable status as long as it meets the requirements. And sets up a cooperative business model. I'm wondering if that means that one of the members or one of the officers is a cooperative business, or, I understand what you're saying now. So can you be an incorporated society and have a business within that? And incorporated societies are inherently cooperative because it's all about democratically run organizations. Cool. Yeah, so yes, absolutely. You can be an incorporated society that has trading activities. Any of the structures we've looked at today can have trading activities, and your strategy for how you deliver on your social purpose is not really anything to do with your legal structure. But yes, you can do all of those things under an incorporated society. You can do it for the benefit of your members or for the benefit of society as a whole. And those members get to vote into power the officers who would be responsible for the general oversight of the trading activities. So the only limiting factor here is that you couldn't take on investment for growth, which may not be a limiting factor if you can fund yourself very quickly off your trading activities alone. Also to consider with cooperative structures is sometimes having democratic voting rights and stuff can be inefficient, but can be really important if that's the basis of your social enterprise. So it's always a weighing up exercise. And yes, a company can get charitable status. The purpose of that would be, you might find that so often a charity will want to be a company because it means that shareholders can always, so if it's more of like a founder-led charity, the person who sets it up can be a shareholder forever and have some level of control over the direction of the charitable company. Whereas if you set up a charitable trust and you're the settler, you kind of put some rules in place that trustees have to act within, and then the trustees have way more of a say over what's happening going forward. So it's very high level and subtle, but it means that if you're a charitable company, the founders can have that level of ongoing control. Hopefully that answers your question. So then we look at the governing documents. So a company, for example, we've said that it can also be a charity, which means that it has a charitable purpose and that it can't distribute any of its assets. But you can also protect your mission without having to get charitable status. And one of the ways you can do that is through your governing documents. So you have in your governing documents, so that's either a company constitution, a trust deed for a trust, the rules of an incorporated society, you can set out that your organisation exists for a certain purpose. So it could be for reducing harm to the environment, it could be reducing obesity amongst Māori and Pacifica populations. And that means that anyone who's in the position of a board, they have to adhere to that, and they are legally responsible to, with whatever their strategy is, further that purpose. So obviously there's a lot of leeway in terms of how you execute on that purpose, but they have to be able to justify that all of their actions are in furtherance of the purpose. And then we look at the shareholders, how they interact with each other, the shareholders or the members. And yeah, when you're setting up an organization, you can change these rules in your governing documents and say, you know, everything has to be decided by a unanimous majority, or it's those kind of things, how you interact with each other in terms of exercising your powers. And then it looks at the officers, so the board of directors, and you can decide what they actually have powers to do, or whether they have to always go and seek approval from shareholders. And then how do they report back to shareholders, and how are they held accountable? So it's just lots of rules that inform how these different high-level players can interact. So let's have a look at mission. Once we've decided, okay, we need to incorporate, we want to have a legal structure, because you have to when you incorporate, and say I've picked a company structure because I want to be able to scale my enterprise. I want it to be international so that I can solve the problem of, I don't know, poverty in the world. That's a massive task. But you might want to think about, how do I make sure, because I'm not a charity and I don't have my mission locked in, I don't have an asset lock, and I don't have a governing body looking at whether I'm keeping in accordance with the charitable status. How do I protect my mission and make sure that we don't end up just becoming focused on money and maximizing profits? So there are a whole bunch of ways that mission drift can happen. And actually, the first one is nothing to do with your legal structure or any rules. It's actually lack of strategic direction. So the very first thing you need to do if you're starting to grow and you're starting to take on investors and share power with people, or you're just trying to find funding, the most important thing you can do is know how your activities are creating the change you want to see in the world, or at the very least knowing what the changes that you want to see in the world and vaguely how you're going to get there. Because if you don't really know that, it just becomes really easy to shift in order to make life easier for you or to access more money. So there are actually a lot of just plain companies out there that are doing awesome stuff. So an example of that would be Eat My Lunch. They are a company. They don't have any charitable status. They haven't locked their mission in, but it's inherent in their business model and their strategy that children are fed that otherwise wouldn't have lunch. So yeah, it doesn't necessarily have to be locked in. Another issue which I've kind of covered is chasing the money. If you just get really desperate, and this is totally understandable, but you need to pay the people, you might start saying, okay, well, this person's willing to give me money, but they want this, which is slightly different to the purpose for which I'm operating. But you're desperate for money, so you take it on and promise them that you'll also achieve this social purpose. That can be another way for mission to drift. And then the last one is sharing control. So this is big for companies, for example. If you start sharing control with numerous shareholders, or if you're an incorporated society and you start bringing on a whole bunch of new members and you don't have any rules around what the purpose is and how people are held accountable to that, then the voice of the masses can start pushing you in a different direction, which could be, okay, actually, we're not that interested in this purpose. It's a nice to have, but we want to focus on maximizing profits. That's a real danger when you start sharing control with a whole bunch of other people. So the first thing to look at, so at the beginning, we talked about governance and how that can be laws or rules. It can be power, it can be language, and it can be norms as well. So the governance of the company runs right from whatever the legal structure is through to who's in power and gets to make strategic decisions, into what are the policies of the organization and how the employees interact with each other, and then even into the culture of the organization. So one thing that you really want to think about is who's leading the organization, who's on the board. And that's probably a lot of you at the moment. And I would encourage you to think about all of the aspects of your business. And are you actually in a position to be an expert on all of the business needs? And the likelihood is, well, actually 100%, the answer is no. So it's really important to know your strengths and your weaknesses. And then you can go out to different kinds of experts who can fill that kind of skill gap. And at the beginning, that will be in terms of an advisory board probably, because when you're in the early stages, people don't really want to take on the risk of becoming a formal board member because that comes with liabilities. But yeah, always thinking, okay, if strategic direction is really important, which it absolutely is, in terms of actually making any money, but also of keeping on the right track with my mission, I need to make sure that I've got the right people around me. How many people do we need to have on a board? That's really up to you. I think in the early stages, so you might be a one-person board formally to start with. You might be the sole director or the sole trustee. But you'll want to have other people around you advising you. So in the early stages, that might be 3 people. It might be, formally, it might be 1 or 2, and then you might have 2 or 3 advisors. Once you start to grow, I think a normal number would be about 3. But if you look at banks, for example, some of the biggest organizations in New Zealand or the world, they tend to have kind of 6 to 8. So it really doesn't matter so much in the number. It's about the skills that you need and the expertise, and have you filled those? How many people do you need to fill that? And that can either be in a formal board position or it could just be on an advisory board. And these are some examples of the kind of skills that you'll need. Obviously, what I haven't put in here is, I have area of impact. So people that, in a social enterprise, it would be really important to have some people that are experienced in knowing what actually creates an impact. How can you tell that an impact's been created? What kind of things do I need to do in order to measure my impact? Or to make sure I'm actually making a difference. That's the kind of stuff that's really important when you're setting a strategic direction of the impact that you want to create. When I mean formally, does that mean in document? Yes, so when I say formally, it means they are registered as a member of your board as part of the registration process when you're incorporating. So for a company, that means when you set up the company, you have to have them registered as a director. And for a trust, is the same thing. You have a register. You can either put their names directly into the trust deed, or it can be trustees from time to time, and it's the person that's on the register. Cool. So yeah, it's just important to go through and think about the skills that you need for your organization, and how you're bringing that into the organization. And so that is, that's part of the language part of governance, people advising you. It's about power. You can get people on your board that have lots of connections or power within some kind of sector. So really thinking about all the ways an organization can be influenced, and thinking about that in terms of your overall governance. And this is my triangle of mission protection. So there are a whole bunch of ways that you can ensure against mission drift, whichever legal structure you choose. And so I've got here from the top down to the bottom, it goes from kind of light touch, probably least amount of protection, down to quite involved, potentially cumbersome, but also the strongest protection. So it's kind of a weighing up exercise about how deep you need to go. So the first one is alignment. If you have alignment amongst all of the people, that creates culture, that creates norms of what kind of direction the organization is going in, and especially in the early stages, before you start taking on investors or funders or just getting too large, that's enough. So you might need to set up a company, but you might think, okay, well, we've only got 3 shareholders at the moment. We're all completely aligned on the direction. We're actually not going to bother looking at a constitution and how we define the purpose until we absolutely need to, which is often when you start taking on investors. Because at that stage, what's much more important than worrying too much about legal structures is thinking about the strategic direction of your business. The next is the business model. So this won't always be applicable, but sometimes you can have a business model which inherently protects your mission. So an example is probably conscious consumers. They exist to serve customers who are interested in purchasing from companies that aren't ruining the environment or treating their workers badly, or using inorganic food. That's their market, that's their customers, and that's their whole value proposition. So for them, it's less important to kind of lock their mission in or get charitable status because it's so inherent in their business model that they're making the difference that they want to see. The next one's limiting investor control. So this is if you're starting to bring on new shareholders. You can structure the deal of they're giving you money, and in exchange you're giving them a right to participate in profits, maybe some control over the company, but you can actually strike a deal with them to limit their control. So yeah, it can all be very flexible. Traditionally, shareholders get voting rights and participation in profits, but that doesn't have to be the case. So yeah, you can limit investor control if both parties agree to that. The next one's mission lock. So that's going into your governing documents and thinking about defining your purpose and why you exist within the documents, which makes it a legal responsibility for the officers of the organization to further that mission and be able to justify all of their actions. And then there's asset lock, and this is what we talked about earlier, not being able to make distributions and not subsidizing things that aren't in accordance with your charitable purpose. This can make it difficult to raise money if that's something that you need, not always. But yeah, the purpose behind it is that people don't get distracted by maximization of profits. And finally, there's charitable status, which we've covered already. You have to lock in your mission, you have to have an asset lock, and then on top of that, you have a regulatory body that oversees things and makes sure that you're not breaching any of your requirements of charitable status. So these are all really good ways of protecting mission. And I think as you go through, it's important to think about what you need at this stage. So the key points are social enterprise is not a legal form, it's an activity. Oh, sorry, what does mission look like in implementation? Does that mean putting it? Yes, so it would be going into the company constitution, or it could be, I guess, shareholders agreement, but it would have to be legally enshrined, which means it's written into some kind of governing document. And Cool. So yeah, social enterprise is not a legal form. It's an activity. So when you're choosing a legal form, it's about thinking about what your activities are and how can you best facilitate those activities. And that might be, if you're like a community-led organization, that's probably with some kind of democratic control. If you're a product or service provider, it's potentially by having the ability to grow and scale to the size of the problem. So those are the main considerations, really. But remember that a legal form is about facilitating your activities. It doesn't inform what your activities are. And the next thing, legal form is about the interaction between funders, governance, and customers. I really just covered that. And then a really important thing to remember is that people are a crucial part of governance. Who do you need on your team? How can you ensure that all of the people within your team are, are aligned and are working well together? That's such an important part of achieving your mission, and it doesn't all come down to legal structure. And what I haven't gotten here, but it's also important, is think about when it is important to incorporate, because often the really important thing that you need to do right now is doing your business model or your impact model, or going out and validating your products and services with customers. And the legality doesn't become so much of an issue until you actually start entering into legal transactions, like taking on funding or taking on a contract of some kind or selling to customers. So always think about what your enterprise needs right now. So here are some examples of what we do at Ākina. Today you're in a workshop. We also run advisory services for all stages of social enterprise. We have some programs. Thrive is out in the regions. If you are not in one of the 3 main centres, you might want to look up the Thrive program. Development funding is about helping social enterprise with that really early stage funding because of the access issues with charities that sometimes have issues giving to social enterprise. We're doing a bit of work around trying to create more development funding for social enterprise. And then we have a couple of accelerator programs like the Launchpad. Growth services is similar to advisory, and impact investing. So if you're starting to scale and you need investment, we'll help you kind of figure out the ins and outs of taking on investment while still protecting your mission. I have a question here. Do you have a clear definition for social enterprise? It is a difficult one, but the line at Ākina, and different people have different opinions, is that it is an organization that exists to create or exists for a social or environmental purpose, and it achieves this by using trade in order to sustain its activities. So on the one hand, it exists not to maximize profits, but to not to maximize profits, but to achieve social impact. But it uses trade and potentially investment as a mechanism to achieve and grow that social impact. And another question, will I have to look up Thrive for further information? Yes, so you can go onto our website, which, let me see if it's, no, it's just my email address. So our website is www.arcania.org.nz. You can go onto the website and go into programs and have a look at Thrive and see where it's happening at the moment. Alternatively, you can email me, or you can just email our main contact centre, which is info@arcania.org.nz, and they'll give you some information about the different programs, or if you explain to them what you're doing, they might be able to point you in the right direction. So yeah, I'd really encourage you to go onto our website and have a look at the different services and things we do to help organisations. And And also have a look at the different workshops that we do, because I've talked a bit today about needing to understand what your business model is and what your impact model is before you start actually trading or creating a legal structure. And we have workshops and services that can help you with all that stuff as well. So yeah, definitely encourage you to go onto the website. What I do have, done that one here, is a couple of useful links. The Simmons Stewart link that's a law firm that has, they have a lot of templates, so it's mostly for the company structure. But yeah, you can go in and get a template and write your own constitution, so you don't have to go to lawyers for that. It might still be a good idea to go to lawyers. The other thing is impactterms.org is an international website which gives examples of how you can enshrine mission in your business. That might be worth a read. But yeah, any kinds of templates and stuff, you can find a lot of that stuff online. And if you want the details of some lawyers that won't charge you, a huge amount, I can probably point you in the direction of some law firms, Simmons Stewart, for example, that are really good with startup businesses. Another question, what are your thoughts on fair shares model of social enterprise? Ooh, I'm not entirely sure what that means. Is that kind of like equal voting rights? I'm going to Google that really quickly. That's the end of the content, really. So if any of you have any more questions, please fire them through. Otherwise, thanks very much for coming. Okay. Again, I'm not too familiar with this fair shares model, but it seems like it's just one of many. And I think if it suits your social enterprise, then that's great. But yeah, it seems to be a model of kind of setting up your organization and how you measure your social impact. So yeah, all frameworks are good. They're all helpful to someone. But yeah, can't comment too much on that at this time. Any other questions? Flick me an email if you want to discuss it further, Anne. Sorry, I can't be more helpful at the moment. Okay, cool. Thanks, everyone. Do flick me an email if you want to discuss anything. Otherwise, hopefully I'll see you and your social enterprises in the future. See ya.